When the economy gets tough, the corporate world doesn't just tighten its belt. It kind of puts on a show. All of a sudden, discipline isn't just a smart financial strategy, it's a performance for investors. So let's get into why this show of austerity becomes so fashionable in hard times and what the hidden cost really is.
Yeah, this quote really nails it. During a crisis, cutting costs and hoarding cash isn't just a financial move. It becomes a social signal. It sends this powerful message to investors, to boards, to the banks saying, hey, we're responsible, we've got this under control. And that story, that narrative of discipline, can literally determine who gets funding and who gets left out in the cold.
So, what happens when the market starts getting shaky and uncertainty is just the new normal? Well, the old playbook gets thrown out the window. Companies pivot from a strategy of growth to one of pure survival, and they enter a phase that we can call defensive finance. Now, we're not just talking about saving a few bucks here and there. This is a fundamental shift in corporate strategy. The goal is no longer about maximizing growth. It's about building a fortress to survive a potential storm. It's a full-on retreat into a defensive crouch. And this defensive playbook, it's got three core moves. First up, cash hoarding. Companies start piling up huge reserves of cash. Second, capex restraint. They slam the brakes on capital expenditures, the big money spending on new buildings, new equipment, and tech. And third, aggressive cost controls. Pretty much anything that isn't seen as absolutely essential gets the axe.
The main reason for all of this is a really powerful preference for liquidity. I mean, when the future is a giant question mark, cash is way more than just an asset. It's your safety net. It lets a company ride out the storm without having to go looking for expensive or maybe even non-existent loans. In a crisis, cash is king. Period.
But this all raises a deeper question, right? Why does this whole defensive move feel so natural, so intuitively correct to managers and leaders? To understand that, we've got to look beyond the balance sheet. We have to dive into the psychology of it all. And this is where things get really fascinating, because it's where classic economics runs right into behavioral science. The decision to cut back isn't always as purely rational as it looks. There are some really powerful cognitive forces pushing things along. One of the key ideas here is something called threat rigidity theory. Basically, when we're faced with a major threat, like a recession, our brains don't really get creative. Instead, we fall back on the most basic, deeply ingrained survival scripts we know, and for a business, that script is almost always the same: cut spending. And that instinct gets supercharged by two other powerful biases. You've got loss aversion, which means the psychological pain of losing a dollar feels about twice as strong as the pleasure of gaining one. And then there's the herd mentality. When companies see their competitors cutting costs, they feel this huge pressure to do the same thing. And that creates a massive system-wide wave of austerity. But, and this is a big but, here's the problem. This collective rush to safety driven by psychology has a hidden and often devastating long-term cost. It's what we call the underinvestment trap. And this is the trap right here. A company gets so focused on hoarding cash and avoiding risk today that it starts passing up on valuable projects, the very projects that are absolutely essential for its growth tomorrow. This whole process is like a slow, creeping decay. It starts quietly. A decision here to delay spending on new equipment, a decision there to cancel a new factory. The very gears that drive the company's future start to rust. Pretty soon, that caution spreads to the engine of future innovation, research and development. R&D is often seen as this nice-to-have expense, so it's an easy target when you need to protect short-term profits and hit those quarterly numbers. But see, when you cut R&D, you don't just lose projects, you lose the actual ability to innovate. Your best people might leave, and all that internal knowledge about how to create new things just starts to wither away. And this is the end game. After years of underinvestment, the company loses its competitive edge. It's like a race car that's been left to rust in a garage. It just can't compete anymore, and it gets locked into a state of long-term stagnation that it might never escape. Now imagine this cycle of underinvestment happening across thousands of companies, all at the same time. The damage can become permanent for the entire economy. Economists have a word for this: hysteresis. Hysteresis basically means that the damage from a really deep recession doesn't just heal on its own. The shock leaves behind permanent scars, a lower capacity for growth, for innovation, for jobs, even long after the crisis itself is over. Think about the shape of an economic recovery.
A V-shaped recovery is what you want. The economy bounces right back to where it was headed. But an L-shaped recovery, that's the sign of hysteresis. The economy just flattens out and never quite gets back to where it should have been. It's a permanent step down. So this brings us to the most crucial point of this whole thing. There is a huge difference between smart, strategic discipline and a self-defeating austerity trap. And the real challenge for any leader is knowing which is which when things get tough. Okay, so rational discipline is strategic. It thinks about the long term, it protects key growth projects, and it uses cash to grab opportunities while competitors are weak. The austerity trap, on the other hand, is purely reactive. It's about panicked, across-the-board cuts and hoarding cash just to survive, and it ends up destroying long-term value.
So, if that's the trap, how do you actually avoid it? How can leaders show real discipline during a downturn without getting paralyzed by austerity?
Well, the most resilient companies, they have a clear game plan. First, they actually acknowledge their own behavioral biases. Then, they actively shield their most important strategic investments from those broad cuts. They treat their people like a long-term asset, not a short-term cost. And crucially, they go on the offense. They use the downturn to invest while everyone else is retreating.
At the end of the day, it all comes down to this. The goal isn't just to survive the storm. It's to be in the absolute best position to sail faster and farther once the skies finally clear. True discipline is about preparing for that recovery, not just hiding from the storm. And that leaves us with a really critical question. That line between careful prudence and value-destroying paralysis is incredibly thin. Being able to spot it in our companies and in our economies is going to be the thing that defines the difference between a quick recovery and a lost generation of growth.